Hello! Continuing our video lecturing as we move forward. We are moving into chapter 13 now, and we're getting very, very close to the American Civil War. You were scheduled to read sections 2 and 3 in your textbook, but for lecture, we are going to cover sections 1, 2, and 3, so make sure you take good notes and that you study your notes for the quiz. To start out, we need to talk about economic and lifestyle differences between the North and the South. We're going to start with the South. As you know, the South was mostly an agricultural society. They grew things for the most part. There were very small cities and there weren't very many of them. A couple of the main cities for the South were Atlanta, Charleston, and Savannah, but for the most part, there weren't very many large cities. The Southern society was driven by the rich upper class, mainly the plantation owners. This was a very, very small portion of the society, though. It was only about 1% of the society. So 1% of the society controlled pretty much everything else in society. If someone owned slaves, they were most likely to have less than 10 slaves. Normally when we think of the South, we think of the movie Gone with the Wind, where they had hundreds of slaves and there were huge plantations, but that's not really the factual evidence that talks about, or that's not really what it was like in the South. Only 25% of Southerners owned one or more slaves. So only one or more slaves was what most people owned. So only 25% of the Southerners owned slaves. Only 25% of Southerners owned slaves. So although only 25% of people owned slaves, the general view of slavery in the South was that it was vital to society and that it helped to stabilize the society. Most Southerners believed that African Americans weren't very smart, and so they needed to stay in slavery in order to be a use to society. That's what the South believed about slavery. So now let's talk about the North. We know that the North was a much more industrial society. They had large cities. They had factories. When you think of the North, you think about Boston and New York City and a bunch of other very large, Philadelphia, other large cities that were in the North. Very different from the way things were in the South. The North was growing in population primarily because of immigration. There were lots of people who were moving from Europe to the big cities in the North, and so the North didn't officially have slavery, but there were a lot of poor immigrants who were moving into this North that were basically working for very little money, and they were very, very poor. So the North didn't have slavery per se, but they had what is called wage slavery, where people were working for a very small amount of money. So the big difference, though, between these immigrants and slaves was that the immigrants had the opportunity to rise up in society. The slaves were slaves forever. So those are some of the economic and lifestyle differences between the North and the South. Now we need to talk about some political differences. There were huge political differences, mainly because each side, the North and the South, wanted a different level of government to be powerful. The North supported a strong central government. They wanted federalism. The South, on the other hand, wanted strong state governments, and they didn't want the large federal government to be powerful. So the bottom line here is that both the North and the South differed over which level of government, state for the South, federal for the North, should have more power. And both sides had constitutional arguments to back up their position. And on the next two slides, we're going to look at which part of the Constitution each side used to support their cause. The North used Article 6 of the Constitution to back up their position. Article 6 of the Constitution says, "This Constitution and the laws of the United States and all treaties made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. And judges in every state shall be bound thereby. Anything in the Constitution or the laws of any state shall to the country notwithstanding." So basically, the North was saying the Constitution says the federal government should be the supreme law of the land, and that's why we think the Constitution supports our side. The South also had something in the Constitution which they could point to that said that the states should be powerful. And we look at Amendment 10 to the Constitution, the last amendment in the Bill of Rights, which says the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it, by the Constitution, to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So the North used Article 6 of the Constitution. The South used Amendment 10 of the Constitution. So both sides had a constitutional argument for their position. We can even look at the Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of Independence says that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So basically, the people who are being governed have the choice. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. And remember, the Southerners also had the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions that said if the government was more powerful than than they thought it should be, the states had the right to nullify the act or law, or they could secede. So this quote from the Declaration of Independence, plus the writings of Jefferson and Madison in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, gave the southern states the authority to say, look, we have the right to secede, and North, you can't stop us. All right, a couple other political differences here. The South was afraid of losing its power in Congress. Remember, we're always talking about that delicate North-South balance. And also, there's the tariff issues. You need to remember, generally, how does each region view tariffs? The North favors high tariffs because they want to protect the things that are made in their factories. And of course, the South opposed high tariffs because they're the ones who end up having to pay extra for the manufactured goods. So make sure you remember these two differences when it comes to the tariff. All right, now we're moving into section 2. And one of your questions for this week is a discussion board question, and you are going to write an answer that tells what was the most important thing that you learned about slavery by reading section 2. We're just going to touch a couple high points in section 2 as we go through here. All right. In America, slavery was different than slavery had been in, for example, Greece and Rome. In America, it only involved people of African descent. If you were not descended from someone from Africa, you weren't going to be in slavery in the United States of America. The population had grown in the slave population had grown between 1790 and 1860 from 750,000 slaves in 1790, so less than a million, to 3.5 million in 1860. It's a huge growth of the number of slaves in America. That would be by slaves being born into slavery in America and also by importing slaves into the United States of America. When we get to the late 1850s, about 1 in 3, or 33% of the Southern population was slaves. It's a huge amount. So that's like walking down the street and 1 of every 3 people that you see was a slave. Slaves were treated, another thing about slavery in America was it was a permanent condition for most slaves. You were born a slave and you died a slave, and you didn't have the opportunity to change your position. Yes, some masters allowed their slaves to go free, or they allowed their slaves to purchase their freedom, but that didn't usually happen. And the whole idea behind slavery was it was the result of buying stolen Africans and selling them. So the way it worked is slave traders would go over to Africa and they would buy Africans from other Africans. So the African countries on the coast would go into the middle part of Africa, capture other Africans, bring them to the coast, and then sell them to the slave traders. Now, it depended on what your job was, if you were treated well or if you had a really rough life. So a field worker obviously was going to have a lot harder time than a house slave. Plus, the type of master that a slave had would be a huge difference between the way if their life was good or bad. Now, the main problem though with slavery is that slaves didn't have basic human rights. If a master became angry with a slave, he could beat the slave, and there was nothing that anyone could do to stop him. Also, slaves were sold. So a slave might have a husband, or they might be married, they might have children, but that didn't stop the master from selling one of the parents or selling the husband or the wife and separating families and breaking up families. So slaves didn't have basic human rights. All right, so let's talk about how the Africans responded to plantation conditions. One way was the Underground Railroad, and this helped blacks to escape to the north. And we read to you about the Underground Railroad, and this is going to be from my book, and it's called Traveling to Freedom. So most of the fugitive slaves who traveled the Underground Railroad were men, between the ages of 16 and 35. Now, let me just pause for a second. The Underground Railroad wasn't actually underground. It was just that it was secret and not talked about very much, and so it was underground in that way. The railroad had little organization in the South, so slaves traveling from there had to find their own way. A common method of navigation was following the North Star. Another method involved looking for tree moss, which grew only on the north side of the trees. Once a slave got to the region of the Underground Railroad, fugitives could anticipate more assistance. Railroad stations were generally 10 or more miles apart. Slaves could identify stations in several different ways. Some indicators were a candle in a window, a lantern in the front yard, a drinking gourd, which symbolized the Big Dipper, which points to the North Star, or a special quilt hanging on the clothesline. Station conductors, the people who lived in these houses, would give the fugitives food, clothing, and shelter during the day, and at night they would either tell the slave how to get to the next station or they would actually take them there. So these conductors were actually breaking the law in order to help slaves to escape. Then we have the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, and that forced the Underground Railroad to extend all the way to Canada because no longer was a runaway slave safe once they crossed over into a northern state. So Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 forced the Underground Railroad to go all the way to Canada. Say that one more time because that's important. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 forced the railroad to go all the way to Canada. Many Southerners actually were afraid of slave rebellions, and some men even slept with guns to keep themselves safe. One major thing that a lot of Southern states did to prevent slave rebellion was they made it illegal to teach slaves how to read and write. Southern states made it illegal to teach slaves how to read and write. Some Southern states prevented slaves from learning how to read and write. Just think about that for a second, not being able to read at all. One more time, some Southern states made it illegal to teach slaves how to read and write. All right, now we need to talk about the word abolition. There were lots of abolition movements, and abolition basically means the desire to abolish slavery. There's a couple different people that we need to talk about. The first one is Frederick Douglass. He was a slave who had escaped, and then he started to speak and write about freeing the slaves, and he published a anti-slave newspaper called the North Star. So Frederick Douglass was a leading Black abolitionist. Another slave who was important to helping slavery get abolished was Harriet Tubman. And she worked on the Underground Railroad as a conductor, and she led over 300 slaves to escape on the Underground Railroad. And one word that you need to make sure you know here is emancipation. I'm going to spell that for you. Emancipation. E-M-A-N-C-I-P-A-T-I-O-N. Emancipation. And that is the idea of freeing all of the slaves. Emancipation, freeing all the slaves. Emancipation, freeing all of the slaves. Now, you need to understand that most Northerners were not abolitionists. Let me say it again. Most Northerners were not abolitionists. They cared about economic issues. They wanted their businesses to do well. They wanted their factories to go well. But most of them were not abolitionists. They didn't care about slavery. They didn't want to abolish slavery. So make sure you write that down too. Most Northerners were not abolitionists. I'm just going to read this to you. Slavery was more than just a political issue. It was also a religious issue. Most Americans applied the Bible to all areas of society, which made their inability to reach a consensus on slavery a cultural crisis. So we're going to take a moment here and talk about how the South used the Bible to support slavery and how the North used the Bible to go against slavery. First of all, the North. They had to use broad Bible principles rather than specific verses. There is no verse in the Bible which says, "Thou shalt not have slaves." But we do know that Jesus taught that we are to love our neighbor. We're to treat other people the way that we want to be treated. And so those were the kinds of ideas that the North used to say that slavery was wrong. But the South used the Bible because at first glance it seems to support slavery. But biblical slavery and Southern slavery were very, very different. So if you look in the Bible, you will see that Paul talks about how slaves should behave towards their masters. Or in the Old Testament, it talks about how a person was going to be a slave for a certain amount of time, but if they wanted to stay a slave, they could stay a slave. But Southern slavery was a permanent thing. You couldn't choose to continue to be a slave if you wanted to. And also remember that slaves in the South were all African slaves. There was no difference between, there was no distinction. If you were African, you were pretty much going to be a slave in the South. So we're going to leave off for this portion of the lecture. There will be another lecture video for you to watch as well.